Dr. Jacobs, thank you for joining us. I haven't been fortunate to meet you. I'm meeting you for the first time. I'm sure you've seen my picture on the flyer. So it's good that, I'm meeting you in, I'll say in person or in Zoom, seeing your face. So it's a great privilege. And thank you so much for always joining. We don't take you for granted. We're always happy to have you. It's good to know that, you answer us whenever we call. So thank you for your time. So for those of us that haven't met Dr. Joella, I would go ahead and, just read a bio very quickly. Before you joined us, we were having a very interesting conversation about waste in, some parts of Nigeria, how, we still have like litters, on the road, and we're talking about, so it's good that today we're talking about, policies, because, you cannot underestimate the importance, of policies in countries, communities, wherever we find ourselves. So I'll go ahead and introduce our very lovely Dr. Joella. She's a professor of German studies and affiliates with Arizona Institute for Resilience, Solutions for Environment and Society, the Department of Gender and Women's Studies, the Arizona Center for Judaic Studies, and the Graduate Interdisciplinary Program on Social, Cultural, and Critical Theory. She researches the intersection of 19th to 21st century German literature and film with plant studies, animal studies, environmental humanities, Jewish studies, the history of science, and sexuality. She has published articles and edited collections, special issues on monstrosity, animal narratology, phytopoetics, cultural environmentalism, contemporary German Jewish identity, etc. She founded and maintains the Literary and Cultural Plant Studies Network and is currently completing a monograph about non-human forms of life in the modernist microgenre of literary grotesque. She received the 2019 College of Humanities Distinguished Teaching Award and 2020 University of Arizona Foundation Lester and Catherine Sherrill Creative Teaching Award. So Dr. Joella, thank you for joining us. You've achieved so much. I only hope that I can be this much. Thank you so much. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me. Thank you for this lovely and welcoming introduction. I'm always happy to be back. Yeah, I'm really glad we have this connection. Now let me share my screen. I have just a little presentation to help us, to have something to look at. And let me just get it into full screen mode. All right, are you seeing the first slide? All right, great, thank you. All right, so you might have just heard my bio, and you might have seen, the word Germany in the title, and you might have wondered what does that have to do? Why, why is she coming to Clan? And how do we connect this to Nigeria? And so let me start there a little bit. So just to introduce a little bit what I'm thinking about. So one of the keywords in my research is cultural environmentalism, because the evidence tells us that environmentalism is not the same everywhere. It's culturally shaped, it's historically shaped. So it looks different in Nigeria, it looks different in Germany, it looks different in the US or here in Arizona where I am currently. And of course, we kind of know that, we kind of see that, but one of the things I'm really interested in is thinking about how can this be productive for us to think about, like if we're looking at a different culture of environmentalism, what are the things that we either, that inspire us, or that are things that are where we realize we can learn from the failures other people have, made and do better already. Or we see that certain things work in certain systems and not in others. I teach a class on that here in Arizona, in the bachelor on the bachelor level, where we look at German environmental culture and US environmental culture. And the students are also invited to bring in other cultural experiences. A lot of them have different cultural backgrounds. And so we have a lot of ways to think about environmentalism. We get a lot of models from different countries and in different environments, which is always very productive. The big thing for that is it's not meant to say, this environmental system is better than the other, or this one, is more advanced or less advanced. That is not the goal at all. The goal is to look at what works in which kind of context and how did they make it work, right? And especially because you mentioned policies at the beginning. That's an important part. But then the question is, do people follow the policies? How do we get the policies to be part of the culture? How do we change cultural mindsets, right? How do we get people to consider the environment in the first place? Because, of course, people consider, they consider themselves first, right? They consider their direct needs, and that is very understandable. And so environmental needs are often secondary to that. And so how can we connect them and make them primary for people? A lot of conversations that we have are actually about laziness in this class, because we realize, even if the infrastructure is there, even if the policies are there, a lot of people just don't go out of their way. So how do we motivate them, right? And as you all know, there are lots of environmental news that can scare us into acting, and that's one side of it. But then there's also, of course, the sense that people don't just want to act out of fear. They also want to be inspired, right? They want to be motivated for different reasons. They want to see what it gets them, which, is something that I always see in Clan, the motivation to change something, right? So one of the things that I want to talk about today is a little bit about protest, and especially youth movements in German environmental history, because every time I've been interacting with media, for instance, and we've learning more about what Clan is doing, seeing that on social media, I keep thinking sort of of similar movements in Germany. And so I figured that might be a point of interest to just see, what have people done, how have they done it, where have they been successful, and where have they failed, and why. And we're looking at Germany because that happens to be my area of expertise. And I want to really emphasize that this is not meant to be a colonial gesture, an imperial gesture of saying, oh, look at Germany doing this. Absolutely not. That's why we're going to look at quite a few failures in this context. So I figured I'll give you a little bit, just really brief environmental history of Germany and its related protest culture, just a couple of, decades to look at here. We're starting with 1968 because we have student protests in many countries around the world in that time. In the US, people are protesting the Vietnam War, right? You can picture maybe the hippies with their long flowing hair. That's what's happening there. In Germany, that's happening too, but a lot of what the German protests are also about are addressing for the first time what the generation of these students' parents did during the Nazi regime. That's a really important part for German history there. But what starts with these student protests is also beginning environmental awareness, the kind of sense of what are we inheriting from our parents, and where does the future take us? So these student protests really began a cultural revolution, a cultural shift. If you picture maybe a stereotypical 1950s American or German housewife, that's the 50s. And then with the 60s, we get all of a sudden hippies, mini skirts. We have a real cultural revolution, a real shift. So that's why I'm bringing this in here, because it's one of these examples of major cultural shifts that's shaped by youth protests. Now, that kind of protest tradition is picked up in the 70s and then especially the 80s, and people are protesting about things related to the environment in Germany. One of the big topics is saving the rainforests from deforestation, generally saving the forests from acid rain, and also protesting nuclear waste storage in Germany. What comes out of these big movements at that time is the Green Party, which is an official party in parliament in Germany to this day. And it begins as an environmental party. So it's kind of a one-issue party. It's all it's interested in is environmentalism. Now that over time has to change because if to be a fully fledged party, elected party, you kind of have to have a stance on other issues. And so if you skip ahead to the 2000s, you see the Green Party's transformation. That party had to become a full-fledged member of parliament to stay successful. So they had to develop a stance on education, family, all sorts of other political issues. And that wasn't easy because the people came together over environmentalism. But the party has done that in really interesting ways. And so if you're looking for political case studies, the German Green Party is an interesting case. If we jump back a bit in the 90s, it's all about the hole in the ozone layer. And we see that there, the protests were actually quite successful. And there's a cultural shift. Again, people stop using certain products like hairspray and so forth that contribute to these kinds of emissions and pollution. And the ozone layer, this is one of the success stories, right? That the hole in the ozone layer started closing up. So what we're looking at here are always kind of keystone moments, right? There is an issue that people are galvanized around with the help of the press and so forth. Save the forests becomes a slogan. The hole in the ozone layer becomes a slogan. You see stickers, you see all of that. So just to sort of see that, the environmental movement kind of course, takes on its particular issues. Now, if we jump into the 2010s, you are probably in familiar territory. Fridays for Future, Greta Thunberg from Sweden, they start their school strikes. And in Germany, the person who is really spearheading that is called Luisa Neubauer. We sort of see those school strikes. Fridays for Future is still quite active, and Greta Thunberg is sort of known around the world at this point. But what has happened more recently, really in the last 2 years, is the emergence of a new movement that's called Die letzte Generation, or the last generation. And maybe you've seen some of this in the news. What these activists are doing is they're gluing themselves to important things. So important things meaning they gluing themselves to expensive and old artwork in a museum. They will glue themselves to the road or to an oil truck. So literally they will put glue on their hands and glue themselves to these objects. And then the police and the people, either in the museum or wherever it is, have to, it takes a long time to get them, loose. They obviously can't injure them. And so they are disrupting things quite a bit. And people aren't happy about that. And so especially the older generation and some of the conservative press is saying that this is climate terrorism. Now, we've seen, of course, other kinds of climate terrorism that are really terrorism, right? People have, thrown bombs about climate change. That has happened, especially if we look at the 1990s in the US. We see quite a bit of that. But yeah, right now the conversation is it climate terrorism if you use glue and stick your hand on the Mona Lisa or something like that? So that's what we're looking at. And this is the really recent part. Okay, so now you have a little bit of a background of sort of what the big button issues are in German history in this regard. So let me move us to my next slide here. I picked out a couple of environmental systems. We can talk about others if you're interested, but I just figured I'll lead with a few examples and then we'll see what you're interested in. One of them is recycling. which is of course something that I know you are engaged with as well, which goes along with packaging laws and bottle return. We can talk about public transportation, and then I also have an example from renewable energy, because there's a really particular case happening in Germany in that regard. So what I'm going to do is just tell you really briefly what things look like with these sort of in these sectors in Germany. The German recycling system is very specified. So it's everywhere. Everybody has recycling. So the infrastructure is there. And so it usually works with different color bins. People have some of them at home. If it's more unusual recycling needs, there's like a place they can bring things. But in public spaces, there's also the basic recycling options for paper, plastic, glass, and waste. And then stuff like bottles and cans, you pay a little extra of a few cents. And then when you bring them back to the store, you get those cents back. So families will collect, those bottles, I don't know, in their basement. And then when they go to the store, they bring them back. And if people go out and they have a bottle and they don't want to bring it back to a store because it seems inconvenient, they will put it next to a trash can. And there are quite a few people, homeless people, unhoused people, sometimes people who are retired, who supplement their income by collecting these bottles, and who walk around, on a Friday night or after a concert and just collect those bottles that people leave behind. So that system is called Pfand. So that extra money is called Pfand that you get back. And this is pretty deeply ingrained in German culture. People will look at you and wag their finger if you're not recycling. And maybe you're saying, oh, this is wonderful. Everybody's recycling. And it's been part of the reason why this is so ingrained is because it's been increasingly part of society since the 1980s. So it's a fairly established system. And there are even packaging laws. So there's always like a label on the packaging that tells you which bin it goes in. And the companies, if they don't produce packaging that can be recycled, they have to pay extra. So there are incentives that are both for the population and for companies, which I think is an important combination. But one of the things that has really disrupted, now it says failures and successes here. I told you about the success, but one thing that has really disrupted recycling is that this is actually a quite outdated system. It relies on the fact that people know what to do, right? And that is not always the case. And so if you put the wrong thing in a bin at the recycling plant, that is pretty disruptive. Often they have to then toss the whole bag. What is actually more effective, it has turned out, is single sort recycling, where a machine sorts it. So people put all their paper and plastic and glass into one bin, and then the machine sorts it out. This is what's the system that's here in the US. And when I first heard that that's more efficient, I was really surprised and I didn't believe it. I was like, no, the US is not environmentally friendly. And the Germans have done this for so long. But the system is now changing in Germany. They're doing a lot more single sort recycling, and people have a hard time. And this is one of my points here. A lot of it has to do with, what do people know? What are they used to? How does it function culturally? And if you've done something for 40 years, it's really hard to change. So one thing that I want to say about environmental systems is it's hard for them to stay nimble and adaptive. And our environmental research is obviously changing. And so we need updates. And it's also really expensive and actually an environmental factor to update an environmental system, right? If you have a recycling plant that does things a certain way, it's a huge undertaking to change that. So a country like Germany that has had environmental policies in place for quite a while is a really good case to see what happens after a few decades, and what they hadn't thought about when they implemented these systems, because these systems were kind of implemented for forever and were not taken into account that there will have to be change in the future. So one of the things I think that really we can take away from this already is that if culturally people get it into their head that this is one way to do this and this is the right way and this is how you save the environment, that can become a problem in the long run, right? Because we continue to learn, and things continue to change. Now, I'm not going to talk as much about public transportation. There are a couple policies I want to highlight, however. In order for, one of the things that Germany did was add a tax to gas and also to buying cars that is pretty high. They're making it really disadvantageous. Oh, apologies. Those are my dogs. They're making it really disadvantageous to have a car, and they're making it really advantageous to use public transportation by having a lot of it. There has to be a public transportation stop within 15, a quarter mile of every living area with lots of people, things like that. So they started implementing policies on so many levels that sort of incentivize public transportation and make having a car difficult. And that seems to be working pretty well. But one of the most recent developments has been the question, should public transportation be free? And this is an interesting one. So if you're interested in public transportation in Germany, one of the initiatives that has been underway there is a ticket that can be used in all of Germany on local transportation that is very affordable. And so those are the moments where I think environmental systems, where really the rubber hits the road, because it becomes a question of who can afford to be environmentally friendly, right? And I think at the moments where environmental accessibility can go along with affordability for low-income populations, that's really where we see the most change. And I'm really curious to see how this ticket will develop. So this is something I'm keeping my eye on. That's why this example is in here. And then the last one is renewable energy. And I'll tell you about a particular case. I think I have this on my next slide. Yeah, the special case of nuclear energy in Germany. So Germany is investing a lot in the environment, in the renewable energy sector, but it has a very particular issue. And maybe you've heard about this, that Germany is phasing out nuclear energy. Now, nuclear energy is a fairly clean energy, as you might know, in terms of renewables, right? It's certainly cleaner than coal. But here we see, again, the cultural and historical factors. So Germany is working on what it calls the energy transition, the Energiewende. And if you're looking for more information about this, that term there's an energiewende.de website that is also fully translated, things like that. The reason why Germany is phasing this out, the reasons are entirely cultural. When Chernobyl happened in 1986, that fallout traveled over Western Europe, as you might know. And I remember this. We weren't allowed to go outside. We couldn't eat, we couldn't drink milk. We couldn't eat any vegetables or fruit that had been exposed. And this shock really stuck with people. And they said, if, nuclear energy plants can have such malfunctions, we don't want them. And in addition, Germans were very concerned about nuclear waste. And that gets me back to the protest culture. And I'll show you a couple of pictures in a minute of people protesting nuclear waste transports, because that nuclear waste has to be stored somewhere for eternity. And, it's not gonna, it's not recyclable. Let's put it this way, right? So 86 was that big moment. And then the energy transition plans actually relaxed a little bit in the early 2000s, and then Fukushima happened, another nuclear catastrophe, and that renewed Germany's plans to really be completely off nuclear energy. Now, when I say completely off, though, this means they're still importing nuclear energy from France. They just don't want nuclear power plants in their own country, and they're shutting them down. But if you look at a map of Europe, you know that if there were a catastrophe in France, Germany would be just as affected. So it is kind of, I feel like there's a little bit of a double standard here. Now with the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022, these energy questions became really big again, because all of a sudden Germany realized, oh, we're dependent on so much natural gas from Russia. What do we do? And a lot of people installed wood burning stoves. a lot of people, everybody in my family did, and they ordered huge amounts of materials to burn. And a lot more energy was again drawn from coal. And that's obviously one of the dirtiest energies we have. And so it is a really fraught moment for renewable energies in Germany. They do have wind, they do have solar, but there's not as much sun in Germany. But because they don't want to do nuclear energy, and because they can't depend on the gas from Russia, they're now having a lot more dependency on coal again. And they're not actually meeting their targets for this energy transition. And the reason is cultural. And the reason is, you know, in any German you ask, they will say nuclear energy. No, 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 we don't want that. The discussion is not very nuanced. And it took me a while. I was really almost brainwashed in the way I thought about nuclear energy from my growing up in Germany. So the cultural thing is very strong, and it has historical reasons. So that's why I'm given that example. I'm sure there might be things like that in Nigeria as well, where cultural and historical reasons are really shaping how people feel and think about a certain way of, you know, I don't know, whether it's energy or something else. And that's why I'm bringing these examples, because these are the moments where we really can start to understand those cultural aspects, and it needs policies that address that. We can't just say, oh, you're all afraid of nuclear energy, it doesn't matter. You know, it's going to be something that has to be factored in, because political parties run on this platform, right? The Green Party obviously runs on a energy transition platform. And then if other parties don't do that, you know, if the whole population or the majority wants this, they're finding themselves in tricky situations. So, all right. Let me look at the time here. Okay. So now, I want to bring us back to the protesters, especially the youth ones. Just as a reminder, we had the students in 68, we had those Keystone species and problems in the 80s, 90s. Nuclear energy protests started with Chernobyl, the latest, and really, again, flared up in 2011. And then we get Fridays for Future and the Last Generation. Now, I want to show you a couple of images of these nuclear energy protests. Let me just, nope, that's the next slide. Let me just, I think I have to stop share and then share my browser for a second with you. Because I think they're just bring this home better than I could ever explain. All right. Let me just, okay. All right, so you should be seeing my browser now, and you should see sort of a scene of a kind of dark night and people who are working on some train tracks. And what's happening here is that people have locked themselves to the train tracks that nuclear waste trains will come through, right? So they physically put their bodies in the way of these trains. And I'm just going to scroll. This is in English, and I have a link on it on my slides at the end, so you can look at this in detail as well. Gorleben is the place, and these are the so-called castor transports. Those are the containers. So here you see, you know, these are of course really impressive images, impressive journalistic work. You see how impactful this can be and inspire other people to protest, perhaps. You know, this is one of those hands that's locked to the rails. And then here's the people sleeping on the train tracks just to block them, you know, outside or on the road, I guess, in this case. And then the drying off their the sleeping bags in the forest here. So they're camping out. It's not comfortable. Tens of thousands, as you see, is what the numbers say. These are those castor transports that are protecting those or keeping those radiation, you know, the radioactive waste within. They obviously have to, you know, keep radiation in. And, you know, the people sleeping. And then here we see them measuring radioactivity. and of course, if we think about slogans and images, you know, there's also, of course, a really this is Greenpeace Radiation Unit, it says, right? So you see sort of both organizations getting involved, but also the power of images quite a bit. More of those makeshift tents of these activists. There's signs, and here is police trying to open a Greenpeace van that's blocking the route, and that's full of activists. Yeah, so this is sort of what we have in terms of images here. I'll jump back to my slides now. I just figured I'd show you sort of what this protest culture looks like also in the German press, because I think that brings home a little bit how central this is to the cultural understanding, self-understanding in Germany. All right, let me share my... Okay, so now you should be able to see my slides again. Is that working? All right, let me just... Okay, and I have to jump through. Okay, now I presented all of this to you. The protests, and I want to emphasize this, I said the word failures because Germans themselves think there are a ton of environmental failures in their country, and the protests are a sign of that, right? They're sort of the things that they're saying are not where they need to be. And now I do understand that protest culture is embedded in a certain context, right? There is a question about freedom of speech. There's a question about police violence, right? I very much am aware of that, and I by no means want to say that things have to look that way in another context, right? We're really talking about different cultural environments, and it's really important to see what's appropriate and what kind of protest, creative or otherwise, you know, in what kind of formats, physical or on social media, or, you know, is possible in certain environments. I want to definitely emphasize that. But sort of what I've talked about, and just to give you a little overview, that it's culturally, historically shaped, that these systems are difficult to keep efficient and difficult to change. And especially here, what I want to bring out is also the generational factor. A lot of these protests are youth protests. The nuclear protests in Germany, though, are intergenerational. And I think that is making them partly so powerful, because generations are banding together there, which is quite interesting to see. Then the other point I made was cultural beliefs that shape policies are not always evidence-based or most environmentally friendly, like we see with the nuclear energy. They might reflect outdated experiences, you know, and sort of this kind of generational change in party politics and voter populations is apparent in German history. And then last but not least, is obviously very complex. It adds lots of complex dimensions that I'm happy to talk about with you more now in the remaining time that we have, such as freedom of speech, physical harm, press coverage, the role of the internet, demographics like age, threats of terrorism, which I mentioned with the ones who are gluing themselves, right? And also the redefinition of terrorism in language or in law. Now, this is my last slide, aside from the links I have for you. What might be transferable takeaways? And I am just making some suggestions here. And I know that you're doing a lot of good work and doing a lot of these things. And really, if anything, it's my lack of expertise about Nigeria that will show if some of these things aren't applicable. So the awareness of the historical and cultural factors in local environments, designing and implementing systems that are nimble and can adapt. And then one that's important for me as a professor of German is paying attention to language and to rhetoric, right? I deal with literature, so I'm always interested in language. And here this can be in the press, social media, and policymaking and protesting and conversations. I think one of the things to avoid emphasizing, at least from what I've seen in my research, is if there's only one right way, one solution, that can really lock people in. But of course, if there are more ways, it also can create confusion. So it's really a balancing act. And it's the same between this balance of threat and hope, right? The future looks bleak, but in which ways can we also be hopeful so that people get motivated? And then the same is true for, you know, the balance between complexity and slogans. Slogans are really galvanizing, you know, images are really powerful, but then these issues are more complex, as we know. And then protest, you know, can draw attention to the urgency of these issues, but protest can take so many different forms, right? It doesn't have to be physically gluing yourself or tying yourself to something. And then the suggestion of bringing together different generations, I just want to put that out there to see what you think about what that can look like. And then last but not least, I'm just really interested in what you think, what you want to talk about, the questions you might have. And I'm just pointing to it. I have links on here. The first one is the one I showed you. The rest of them go to Fridays for Future and The Last Generation. And then I also picked up a couple of other climate activists from all around the world, Global North and Global South, who can also be found on Twitter and who are all doing interesting things in their respective countries. You see one name here, Elizabeth Watuti, who is in Kenya, and there are others behind these links, which I thought might be inspiring to see what people are doing, but you might also be very familiar or might be critical, which is also totally welcome. So I'll go back to this last slide and just open the floor and see what kind of questions you have or what you might want to talk about.
Thank you, Dr. Joella. Please, if you have any questions or you want to contribute to this conversation, the floor is open. So please, you can unmute and contribute.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, my own contribution would be that I think social media in a way has helped us in Nigeria to open like our awareness, to create an awareness surrounding the urgency for action. I don't think that we got a hang of the climate issue for me, till very recently. I'd say like 5 to 10 years ago. That is when, it became a little widespread here. And I think that, from what you've taught us today, it's been long going in Germany, and that is good to know. Here, it's quite young for us here. And when you talked about the generations and how they came together, in Nigeria, it's almost like that too. The older generation might not understand certain things. You get what I mean? But because they have experienced the wars in the past and the disasters from, nuclear war, they would understand that, okay, now we need to move, now we need to do something, now we need to come together. So they would understand that. And, it's because of experiences. Some people still don't believe in it, even here.
Yeah.
They feel like, what's the force? I guess they think that, nature will somehow take care of itself because they haven't experienced any disastrous impacts of climate change yet. There was a time that I and Ayomide needed to, a group of researchers approached us, and they wanted to measure like carbon footprint. It's also, I'm just adding to like how dynamic these environmental issues are all over the world. And we had to tell them that, things are a little bit different here. We can't, it's hard for us to even measure like the amount of water we use per day. And, you can't tell people to, for instance, not eat meat because our culture here, eating certain protein is synonymous to living well. Yeah. Or being well off, So it's complex, so to speak. Yeah. It's very complex. So if you preach to people and, also the level of, it's not even about literacy. It's not about literacy. It's not just the cultural difference. You can't tell certain people not to eat meat because, it affects the environment. I don't see how how, you know, you would describe that in the right sense, you know. So it's complex, and sometimes even for me it's a bit confusing, even, you know, the right steps to take, you know, what's the next thing to do. We haven't, in my 30 years plus of life, I have only experienced like 2 major protests in Nigeria in my life, because Nigerians are, I don't, for the lack of the right choice of word, I'll just say little docile when it comes to protesting, not as you would have, you know, in the West. You know, people stand up for their rights, speak out, you know, as you know, you already mentioned that, yeah, things are a little bit complex, and, you know, we have we run a democracy, but it's somewhat of an authoritarian style of, you know, government. So people, you know, I remember one time I wanted to join a protest. That was the first one I ever experienced. I was younger then, and my mom sat in front of the door and she was like, you can't leave this house. Oh my God, you're going to die. What if something happens, you know? And that was a setback for me, because I mean, that was my first realization of, you know, my environment. So people don't even have the courage to protest about issues that you would think that would affect their livelihood, you know, more acutely, right? So, you know, protesting for us is not like something that we really do. Sometimes when we see, you know, some of like the extreme videos, the pictures that you shared, we are like, okay.
Yeah, I hear you. No, my students in the US react the same way. They do not feel safe to protest here because of police violence.
Yes.
And so I hear you on that very much. If I may make 2 really small points to the things you said. Germany wasn't a democracy until after World War II, and the democracy was implemented by the Americans. Germany was occupied by the Americans until the 1990s, which most people don't realize. And so, yeah, and the first democracy that Germany had was a spectacular failure. It led to Hitler. And so after the Second World War, Germans really had to learn democracy, and these student protests in 68 are the beginning of that. Before that, that didn't exist, and people did die in these protests. So I just want to say I absolutely understand, and these things, I think, in every country and every culture take their own developments, right? In the US too, with the protest history, and it might not always be the right thing, right? It might look, maybe it doesn't have to be physical protests, because we are also seeing, of course, in other countries where there's even more authoritarian rule, that people use art and the internet and other small ways, right? Small acts to just do it differently. So I don't want to say that this is the expectation, by no means. And the other thing with the eating meat is such an interesting point you bring up. You know what I think can change that in the end? Because Germany is such a meat eating culture. It's really? Like, oh yeah, German sausages, like it's just, you know, and so for the longest time, the meat consumption in Germany was so much higher than other countries, just traditionally over centuries. And it's been changing. And the reason it's been changing is that it's become cool to be trendy, and that celebrities have been doing it, right? And that then all of a sudden and this is what I mean by culture shift, right? You think, oh, we want people to think smart, but you know, and do the right thing ethically, but it just takes a celebrity to say this or that, right? And then good alternatives, right? Then the cuisines have to change, the shopping has to change, like everything has to, like, and that takes, of course, a very long time for these kinds of changes to take hold that are cultural. But I think it's such a great example with the meat eating, because I do think, like in Germany, still a lot of people, my parents eat, they, you know, if I told my dad not to eat meat, he would just say, what are you saying? Right. But my generation, I'm noticing the shift when I come back to Germany to visit. All of a sudden, everywhere I get vegetarian meals. And even just 10 years ago, when we celebrated our wedding in Germany, there wasn't a way to get a good vegetarian option on the menu, really. So things, they take time, but at the same time, I do see the change, and seeing the different cultures. That's for me always where I sort of notice, oh, look, here something has shifted. So that's just my piece for the hope. But I absolutely understand how difficult it is and how complex, and people don't want to change. I get it.
No, people will change, especially like the generation before, my generation. They are like stuck in their ways. Even I don't know what the cultural how it is in Germany, but here, like, the older people are big on respect, and how you talk to your the older generation. You must be very cautious, you must be respectful. And now for our generation, it's cool. It's not a little cool, it's really cool. Like, someone half my age can talk to me, the way that they want to. They can call me by name. I can't call someone twice my age by name. So, and like you said, social media is also, yes, it doesn't have to be, I agree that it doesn't have to be like a physical protest. Social media in Nigeria has also helped, to help several causes, even, against the government. They've had to do certain things because they've been forced to do it, whether certain topics have been trending, or certain, even in politics, so that's why even at Clan, we at some point had to get like a social media person that we pay out of pocket, because it's really important. And like you said, it's it's unexplainable, but when social media personalities, when they carry out, some form of protest on their pages, or they carry out, and they just talk about a topic that is trendy. It's funny how those kind of things gain visibility, and the whole country starts to talk about it, no matter how unimportant you think that topic is about. As long as like an important person on social media, lays emphasis on it, it becomes, it becomes a trendy topic, and everybody wants to talk about it and wants to hashtag it. I know we're talking here and we're sharing slides, but the real impact is on,
Absolutely, it's out there.
on an app like Instagram. And it's just opened my mind to something that we can do, get, one of these important people to, talk about something that matters, if they will, if we push. So it's great that we had this conversation, definitely. I don't know if anyone else, I don't want to be selfish, so please, if you have any contributions, if you can unmute, and so that we don't keep Dr. Joella more than she has already spent with us. She's been lovely. So please, if you want to join our conversation, unmute. The floor is open.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Joella. Definitely, I wanted to stress a point that resonates with me, which is striking the balance between threat and hope, complexity and slogans. So recently in one of my classes here, we had the privilege of watching a video of one of the top officials at EPA, Environmental Protection Agency in the United States. So she was just sharing about her experience, and she said something very related to this, because most environmental slogans or topics are always targeted at saying, oh, before 2050, the world is going to sink. Before 2045, there will be flooding. Before this, this will happen. But she said we can kind of tailor it to talking about hopes that, oh, do you want your children, do you want a better environment for your children? Do you want more food for your children in the next 20 years? Do you want more this or that, more good things for your environment in the next 5 years? Then you have to do this. So yeah, so that's like a point that I'm picking right here for us at Clan, kind of creating stuff like that, or like slogans like that on our social media that we can use and use that. And another one that I thought about is the cultural aspects. Before you came, we were talking about a kind of an ancient city in Nigeria, which is Ibadan, which is known to be kind of dirty and all that. So yeah, people are big on culture and the way they like dispose their trash, their waste, and all of that. So kind of having to blend between the culture and the new things that we have to do is very important. And I think it all still lies. People like to hear good things about the future. They like to hear that, oh, this will happen for my unborn children, or So that's a very great point that I picked, because yeah, people always care about protests. Yeah, no parents, no Nigerian parents will
Yeah.
naturally say, oh yeah, go for it. The last protest we had in Nigeria, NSAS,
Yeah.
yeah, not
Yeah.
everybody, even myself, I was a part of the protest because you're like, oh, you never know what will happen and this and that. So
Oh,
yeah, thank you very
absolutely.
much.
Yeah, yeah. No, I absolutely understand with the protests, and I think the German case is kind of extreme, and that's why I'm sort of showing it. But at the same time saying, yeah, that of course parents will want their kids to be safe, but I think this is a really
Yeah,
good making. And I would add, to bring together the different generations, you might say not just the future for your children, but what about the future for your grandchildren too, right? Maybe get this, because that brings in a generation who really wants to leave a good legacy for their
yeah.
grandchildren, right? And sometimes it takes that intergenerational sort of conversation, and I know how hard these can be. Germany might be different in some respects with elder respect, like was like it just came up, but politically, for instance, there are topics that I really tried to avoid with certain members of a certain generation, right? And because I don't want to fight with them necessarily, right? And it's really hard to pick these battles, because even bringing up an issue at the dinner table is a form of, can be a form of, it can be such a moment, and we're not always ready for it, and we can't, we have to sort of, yeah, again, strike the balance there, I think, because we want to get people on board, and not, people don't like being made to feel bad, I think, and
Right,
environment
right.
a lot of the time unfortunately has that effect. And at the same time, I think what the protest also does, and this is just one small addition, it puts pressures on not just individuals, it puts pressure on organizations, on the government, and on and through the government, then also on companies. And we see that companies can pick up that kind of slogan too. When they realize that they should look green, right? It shifts things too. Of course, a lot of it is greenwashing, but just like the influencers and social media that you mentioned, right?
Yeah,
I do think that sometimes, that kind of moment can have an effect, or that kind of, if a company picks it up, can have an effect. And here, for instance, we're putting pressure on the university to commit to being more sustainable, which happens on lots of campuses and has happened over a while. But so it's not just about recycling; it's also about divesting universities from fossil fuels, for instance. And so, to me, doing that on campus feels like a safer environment than doing it out in the city, for instance, right? And so I think, when we think about picking our battles from the dinner table to where we work, where we live, to out in the streets, I think there are lots of gradations to what we can do.
yeah. Thank you so much for that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much. This has been so interesting. But in fact, even knowing that, Germans, older Germans eat meat as just like us, just like us here. But, hopefully you know, just as Germany has grown over the years, we're hoping that, you know, certain habits become part of, you know, ingrained in our psychology and part of, you know, our culture, because it's a great culture that you have over there that, you know, it's still really hard and, you know, young to translate here. You know, hopefully we're hoping that by 2030, I'm not sure how many of the SDGs how many of the SDGs can be accomplished by 2030. That's a different topic entirely. Maybe you could come and talk to us about it. But I'm seeing 2030, that's in 7 years, and I don't know. I don't know, maybe for a country like Germany, maybe maybe some of those goals don't even concern me. But for Africa, I'm not sure what we can achieve by that
But
time.
even for Germany, you know, don't put Germany on a pedestal. There's a longer history, but I think there are lots of mistakes to learn from too. And like I said, Germany's getting its nuclear energy from France. Germany is shipping its waste to, you know, countries in the global south. You know, there's lots of things that are not going well too. And so I think while what we can see sort of the longer cultural history, which can be helpful, I think for, you know, comparisons in some ways, I do think it's important also to see that Germany likes to see itself in this light, and but I think
we see them in that light too.
Well, but not just words. We have to look at their actions, right? They have to put their money where their mouth is, and I think part of that also means that they need to that they have a responsibility to you know, because they have you know, the per capita, the carbon footprint, since you talked about it, right, of Germany is still higher, so much higher, you know, in Western countries. And so I think that comes with a lot of responsibility, and what shape that takes, I don't know, but you know, it's complicated.
Yes,
Obviously.
it's just the world is complicated all in all, you know, and so many issues are complicated. I agree with you know, everything that you have said. Not all the process, you know, leading to where they are today is great, and hopefully we can pick one or two things from, you know, how far, because because of lack of or just a little less innovation, we're still behind, you know, in the carbon footprint. Well, like most other developed countries in the West, you know, have spread a lot of carbon.
Yes, especially here in the US. It's pretty horrifying. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not even sure about the mass transportation in the US, because the few times that I've been there, everyone has a car. You know, you can't get around without your own. I think Europe is better in terms of, you know, transporting from one place to another place, you know, than it is in the US. They're not even, I don't think that they're doing anything about it.
No, and it's quite difficult if you look. So if you look at cities like Boston and New York, of course you have a good infrastructure within the city. But if you look at a place where I'm at, here in the Southwest, in the desert, where the distances are incredibly big, you know, yeah, there really isn't much there, and there are no plans of changing it, and it's really sad because there is so much wonderful new technology out there, but this is again a cultural thing. People are very used to taking their car, to not depend on someone else, and that so that it brings me always back to the cultural things that shape people's behavior.
Yeah, definitely. America is a whole different, I mean, considering the size of the country as well, it's a whole different ball game. So you can't really compare them to Europe, that have, you know, smaller countries. And in America, I know that, you know, even different states have different cultures.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I'm sure Mita will agree. And if you know, when you ever come to Arizona, you'll see that too.
I can't wait for
Yeah.
him to visit.
Yeah, definitely. I was in Seattle last year, and the culture in the Pacific Northwest is different from Indiana. They are like
Yeah.
different, very different. This is the Midwest, so like very different. Yeah.
Mm.
That's nice. So thank you so
Yeah.
much, Dr. Drella. I don't think that any other person is contributing as it is. So thank you for joining us. We'll hope to have you sometime soon. And I hope Emily will find time to visit you soon.
Yeah, definitely. I must do that.
I was hoping to come to America this year, but I didn't get a visa. So
Oh, that's
yeah,
unfortunate. Well,
yeah.
that's the other part. Yeah.
So
Oh.
hopefully whenever, and
Mhm.
if you ever come this way, so.
I really want to. You know, I have quite a few former and current students from and in Nigeria, and
Oh, really?
we'll see.
That's interesting.
Well, I'm hoping that at some point this works out.
Yeah, hopefully. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you
so
for
much,
having me.
Dr. Jacobs. Yeah.
Mhm.
Thank you everyone for joining us. I hope you learned a lot today. I did, and I had an interesting time with Dr. Joa. You guys refused to contribute, but we had an amazing conversation, and I'm sure Emily would agree.
Yeah. Yeah, sure.
I'm so happy I met you today, you know, because I had to make sure today wasn't, you know, as I planned, but I was like, oh my God, I can't miss this woman for a third time. I had to be there.
I'm so glad we met too. Likewise, I
Yeah.
had asked about you because I'd seen your face
Yes.
on the.
Yes.
I'm like, what kind of person would she think I am? So
No. I was just curious. And if you
Yeah.
want, I can put the PowerPoint in the chat, or I can send it to you after if people are interested in the links.
we definitely are.
Okay.
I guess I can't put it in the chat for some reason. It says there's access is restricted. It doesn't. I can just email it to.
Yes, you can email it to Ayomide and he will share it
Yeah,
on
I'll share with everybody.
our
Yes.
group. Yeah. Thank you
Yeah.
so much.
Yeah. All right.
Thank you
And
so
I hope
much.
everybody has a good rest of their days. No matter how many hours are left.
You
Yeah.
too. You too. Love to your dogs. How many dogs do you have?
2.
What kind of dogs?
They can be loud.
What kind of dogs are they?
One is like a Doberman American Staffordshire mix, so a big one,
I
and
didn't
then
expect
there is
that.
a small one. They look like
What's-
brothers, but they're not.
what are their names?
Max and Charlie.
Oh, Max and Charlie. All right, Max and Charlie. Nice to meet you too.
Likewise. Thank you, everybody.
All right.
Thank you so much.
Enjoy
Bye-bye.
the rest of your long day. We have a shorter time here.
Well, thank you. You
Okay,
too.
bye.
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 Hamzat Sharif. Toluwani, thank you for joining us today. It's always a pleasure to have you.